Well, great turnout again. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. I just want to thank everybody who's participated for the last few weeks. And I think it's been a very successful series and very enjoyable. And all the comments I've gotten is that they really appreciate having something to do on a Sunday afternoon, especially when the Patriots didn't make the playoffs. So it's been fun. And I have to say thank you for all the speakers, not just Jay today, who I'll introduce in just a moment, but all the other speakers, because they did this out of the goodness of their hearts. They were involved in the exhibit, and 5 months ago or so, I said, how'd you like come in on a winter afternoon at 2 o'clock on Sunday and talk about the research you did? And they said, sure, because they didn't hesitate. So, just a shout out to all the speakers. This is going out on Facebook Live, and it will be on our YouTube channel. If you want to tell other people about it and they want to watch it. A couple of announcements, by the way. I'm Jack Santos. I'm on the board here at the Festival Square Company. A couple of announcements. One that you may have heard before that I mentioned, and the other that nobody knows about. You're going to be the first to know about this. And hopefully we'll get the publicity machine going, but being an all-volunteer organization, it's always a struggle to make things happen. First, we've got 2 more sculptures that Jeffrey has kindly agreed to make this year as part of the last, 8 or 9 months of the exhibit. The exhibit runs until the end of this year. So we'll see one sculpture unveiled in April, and then the other sculpture will probably be unveiled sometime in the summer, maybe Yankee Homecoming. We're trying to work out an arrangement, or maybe it's done on the lawn. You can actually see the sculpture on the lawn during Yankee Homecoming. So that's coming. I don't think I'm on the line to tell you what those sculptures are. Can I tell them what they are? Yeah, I don't know if we formally. So the next sculpture that is actually completed and getting ready for the unveiling at the first Friday in April. If you're not a member and you want to come to First Fridays, you got to get your membership. And that is the Holy Terror, Captain William Nichols. So if there's a room downstairs that has a lot of Captain Nichols' items that has been generously loaned to us by one of his descendants that lives in Ohio. And that's the neat thing about this museum. People have scattered throughout the country, and then they come back and they say, oh my gosh, this is all about my great-grandfather. And then we make that reattachment. And that happened with Dr. William Freeman and Captain Nichols. The second sculpture is going to be a little different. We wanted to honor the very first peoples that were on this land. And so it'll be a sculpture of a Native American. So anxiously, I think that's just in the early stages of being made now. And for a more exciting announcement, there's been a lot of rumor, we've been talking about it, COVID got in the way of doing this. June 29th to July 9th, mark your calendars, because we have signed an agreement to have a tall ship coming. And it's going to be exciting. It's the Now Trinidad, and it's a Magellan's ship that went around the world. They are here in the Western Hemisphere from Spain. They've been in Puerto Rico for the winter. They're going to come up in the end of June, and from June 29th to July 9th, they'll be on the dock, open for tours. And we'll have a first Friday that will be focused around the crew of the Now Trinidad, and we'll also have, on the first night they're here, a special gala fundraiser where it will be exclusive access to the ship, and dinner, and music, and dancing, and all that sort of stuff. So that's, I think, I got that Friday right, like June 29th or so. So mark your calendars, July 4th week. Everybody says it's then in Newburyport, July 4th. Not this year, but we're going to have a tall ship on the harbor. Yeah, great. So I think that's it in terms of my remarks. Let me say something about Jay. Jay's a Newburyporter, and he attended Newburyport High School, where he served as a historian for his junior and senior classes. He went to the University of New Hampshire, turned his application for history into a vocation, was the chair of the collections committee at the Museum of Old Newbury, and eventually a curator for 17 years there. And over the past 35 years, he's bought and sold fine art nationally and internationally throughout 5 continents. He's appeared on television, radio as the subject of fine and decorative art, antiques, and historic Americana. I know we take advantage of Jay's expertise, but we get new items donated here to the museum. Served as an appraiser of fine art for John McGinnis Auctioneers over in Amesbury, and he cataloged appraised over $50 million in tangible personal property. Member of the Dalton Club, and also the Amesbury Historical Cushing. So I'll turn it over to Jay.
I was betting that everybody was going to stay home for the Super Bowl. That's why I picked this date. But that didn't happen. So give me a second. I haven't spoken in 10 years, so I'll do my best. So I'm going to set my alarm for 45 minutes. And I thought probably the best way to begin would be kind of an outline of what I'll be speaking on. We'll try to keep it into very small, short, 5 to 10 minute subjects. And the outline would go something like the research that went into this, Jeff Briggs' maquette, the sculpture that they've done for the exhibit, which has brought everyone here. Colonial times in Newbury, the waterside, a little bit of genealogy of where Tristram Dalton came from, his colonial times at Harvard, and then a reading of what I submitted for the publication. And then if we have time, maybe a little bit about his legacy and with the Dalton Club. How's that sound okay?
Yes.
Can everybody hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah? Alice, good? All right. So, I'm not going to dwell on this, but it's kind of interesting doing research today. It's much different than growing up in high school in town here. The internet provides so much information, and I kind of think of it as kind of the information is kind of like the caduceus in medicine, where you have the 2 snakes wrapping around the staff, and the snakes represents the venom that heals and the venom that harms. And I see a lot of information on the internet that does just that. I think that's a hot topic today, but I'm not trying to get political in any way. But I certainly found this in researching Tristram Dalton for a second time. I hosted the Dalton Genealogical Society back in 2006, and we actually had a luncheon for them at the Dalton Club. And that was a very nice gathering. People might not realize, I get kind of egocentric here in Newburyport, where kind of the world revolves around us, and it's easy to lose track of other genealogical societies. The Daltons have a history of coming from Hampton since 1638, which is absolutely true. The Daltons had so many children, and the family got so very large that there's such a large number of descendants for that reason. So, so when I got started, I think some of my first interest in history came from a class that I had taken in the fourth grade under Judith Fuller. Judith Fuller was the daughter of Laura Bradley Fuller. Bradley Fuller's Fuller Field down Low Street, and he was on the school board for decades. And her initiative with Customs House founding member Darcy Van Barkelum, does that name ring a name with anybody here? Darcy Van Barkelum. So when this museum was in its infancy, he was one of the community leaders that helped to build this from scratch, really. And he wrote with Judith Fuller a book for the 4th graders called History at Home. And so there's a copy of it, I know, at the Historical Society, and I'm certain at the Newburyport Public Library, perhaps here. So a little bit about the sculpture. And we see above my head two renderings by Jeff Briggs. One is obviously a sketch, and the second being the final product of his work. And we see that a very interesting pose that was taken from the original portrait, which was painted by Joseph Blackburn. And Joseph Blackburn was, we believe, to be schooled in London, and he was known even today to have very fine attention to detail in the fabrics and the clothing. He does a very good job with the cuffs and the vests, and he painted for a few years in Bermuda. He was one of the few artists that had stopped there before coming to New England. And it's very easy to date his work because he was just in this in the colonies for just under 9 years, 1754 to 1763. And it was about the same time that Tristram was studying law in Salem that he was living in Marblehead. And he was in Marblehead for a very short period of time, between 1756 and 1758. So we know this portrait was taken between 1756 and 1758. We know this because there's a large number of his work that he would sign on the back and date them. And so it was very easy for the historians to be this specific in this for that particular reason. So the pose, why does he have his hand in his vest? And the pose actually goes back to classical times. Isthenes, who was the founder of the rhetoric school, and he suggested in Greece, ancient Greece, and he suggested that speaking with an arm outside of one's chiton or tunic was bad manners. And the pose was used in 18th century British portraiture as a sign that the sitter was from the upper class. An early 18th century guide on genteel behavior noted the pose denoted manly boldness tempered with modesty. And it's hard to tell from this angle of the original painting, but you're kind of looking up at him at the same time too. So if anybody's done the math, knowing that Tristram Dalton was born in 1738 and Blackburn was in Marblehead between 56 and 58, and this portrait of him was taken between the ages of 18 and 20 years of age. And which is, I think, surprising to a lot of us, and it was purposeful at the time to look older than you may have been in order to carry a little more respect and weight, and maybe people would listen to you a little more, and you just weren't some kid. And the hairstyle with curls, I think we immediately see this as potentially being a wig. Wigs were really falling out of favor at this time, and it was most likely that it was not a wig, although I cannot be sure entirely. But the hairstyle was certainly a la mode for the period. So I thought maybe in learning a little bit more about Tristram Dalton, leading to what I've written for the publication, we look at what kind of made Tristram Dalton, what led up to Tristram Dalton becoming Tristram Dalton, okay? And so I'm going to give kind of a little boring history lesson. I don't mean it to sound that didactic, but and it's heavily covered ground. And I see plaques downstairs discussing just exactly what I'm about to, I guess, review with everyone. I've leaned heavily on Peter Benish's Old Town and Waterside, which is a bit of a Bible up at the Cushing House, and it was a catalog of decorative arts that were known to have come from both Newbury and Newburyport. And they kind of compared and contrast what Old Town and Waterside each owned in terms of their tangible personal property. So when we think of colonial Newburyport, we see incorporated in 1764, and that's absolutely 100% true, but I think there's others that will argue that as soon as 1726 came around, when the third parish was established, that's when a church was built on Market Square. Really, ideologically, that was what made Newburyport. The third parish is what made Newburyport. And so the first parish, obviously, is on the border of Newbury and Newburyport. The second parish began where the Celtic Cross is, across from Wendy's and Belleville Church. That was later removed to Pike State Hill. And then the third parish being Market Square. It was also the church that I think Michael Dalton gets credited for his involvement with St. Paul's Church, but actually before there was a St. Paul's Church on the waterfront, there was the Third Parish Church, which he was a member. That can be confirmed by some baptismal records of his 3 children. So the town of Newbury's riverfront area increasingly attract the population of shipbuilders, traders, distillers, and fishermen. All their livelihood depended on the sea. I know you know that. And with the establishment of the third church, that was really the birth of Newburyport. The cultural impact of Newbury's agricultural maritime division appears to have been as far-reaching as the differences in the two occupations themselves. And evidence of this surfaces not only in everyday possessions, but also the contrasting treatments of decorative styles, but in the national and international range of the artists, craftsmen, intellects, whose products and services were brought to market here in Newburyport, and who were themselves a draw to the community in search of careers. So really, it was the cross-pollination of the cultures coming in out of the port of different ships from largely Western Europe. A much clearer pattern of differences between the first parish of Old Town and the waterside emerges in the investment and accumulation of capital. Regardless of their wealth, Newbury farmers almost always put their savings into additional land. The waterside traders, shipmasters, and ship owners were willing to commit a major share of their assets, as well as their lives, into the profitable but high-risk maritime enterprises. So you can kind of see the differences immediately and philosophically how these two groups were starting to drift apart. And they sometimes became very conflicting. And on one hand, there was very insulary Newbury natives, primarily engaged in agricultural occupations. And what compounded their insularity was by marrying largely within a greater Newbury parish system. They saw their own children's advancement almost entirely in terms of land ownership. In contrast, regardless of their means, the seafaring and mercantile families, which were concentrated in Newbury's waterside district, risked more, aspired to more, and pretended more than the farmers of Newbury's rural parishes. the Hamptons, we can also say the same for in the migration of Michael Dalton here to Newburyport, Newbury's third parish. The rural gentry, who were the wealthiest, managed the town of Newbury. And so there was the conflict between the rural gentry that ran the town. You said, why did they run the town? Well, it was the richest. There was a tradition that the wealthiest in the community were the fathers of the town. They were the ones that ran the town. And there's evidence in wills and estates that the farmers who were buying the land actually could buy and sell the sea captains 2- or 3-fold. So some of the richest or wealthiest farmers would be worth somewhere between 1,700 to 1,900 pounds, where the sea captain merchants would be somewhere around 600 to 900 pounds. So although the merchants were really flashy and they spend their money on silver sets and punch bowls and fancy wines and clothing, it was a choice that they had made. It sometimes looks can be deceiving. I think that we can say is true today, or even more so true today. The arrival in Newbury after 1700 of William Johnson, Joseph Atkins, John Crocker, Daniel Marquand, Philip Coombs, Michael Dalton, Anthony Gwynn, and Patrick Tracey, you probably recognize a number of those names, were those, among others, who transformed this town. They were setting themselves into a small but rapidly growing provincial seaport. They imposed an elite Georgian culture over the existing Newbury community. They also brought new religious affiliations and an unprecedented range of marriage networks. The merchant generation who immediately followed them were either sons of these outsiders or were themselves newcomers to the community. Joseph Marquand, Tristram Dalton, Nathaniel Tracey, and John Tracey were second-generation Newburyporters, but their social and cultural worlds lay outside the community. Some of the separation, some of the conflict between the farmers and the merchants came to a head in 1764 when Newburyport ultimately petitioned to separate as a separate town from Newbury. And this was because the merchants would come to the town meetings, and I mentioned earlier that the leaders of the community were the farmers because they were wealthiest. The merchants wanted to have improvements such as more fire suppression. They wanted more schools, and they wanted better streets, and all these did not appeal to the interests of the farming community. And so the tension over taxes created the port of Newbury to separate. You'll see this in a number of other communities, whether it be Kennebunk and Kennebunkport, or Hyannis and Hyannisport, for instance. So, colonial times at Harvard. So we've got a little bit of background. We're trying to figure out who Tristram Dalton is, and so we're giving a little background about the community that he came from, and maybe a little background about Harvard at that time too. So by 1650, the year when Harvard graduated its first American-born student, the class size had risen from a handful to closely 50 students drawn from across New England. So it's kind of hard to imagine Harvard in 1750 having 12 or 13 students in their class per class. To me, that's, I should have known that. I mean, I asked my mother, she knew. I didn't. And when you think of the success of Harvard, a lot had to do with it being supported by the government because they felt that it was important to have, being the first college in the colonies. And for the next 100 years, the college focused its efforts on educating the colony's future leaders, emphasizing the study of liberal arts over theology, rigorous colonial curriculum based upon the medieval trivium and quadrivium. It's just your basic liberal arts course of studies. And they were offering a progressive schedule that began with Latin, Greek, logic, Hebrew, and rhetoric. So Tristram Dalton was studying rhetoric, where that pose came from, they had mentioned early on, in terms of presenting. I found this kind of humorous, and this I found online. I questioned the source, but the source credited documents that are at Harvard, so we're believing them. Students, however, may have had their other ideas about the purpose of the Harvard education. By the early 18th century, the region's newly prosperous port cities were sending a growing number of their sons to Cambridge in the hope of creating young gentlemen. Thinking of their education in terms of fashion, refinement, and proper manners, Harvard students of the new century seemed to place their academic interests second only to their extracurricular pursuits. For instance, a fire destroyed Harvard Hall. A list of claims for replacement items included pipes, tobacco, liquor, punch bowls, glasses, and tea sets. And only one Bible was reported lost. The students' taste for luxury made them vocal opponents of a series of British tax levies that precipitated the American Revolution. The indignant response to the Tea Act and the Townsend duties on paper, senior class members voted to abstain from drinking tea and insisted that their degrees be printed on domestically manufactured paper by the Patriot newspaper presses. By the mid-18th century, Harvard had become, above all else, a recruiter of intellectual talent and a unifying central force in Massachusetts and neighboring New England colonies. Now, you think, who was Michael Dalton who thought to send Tristram to Harvard? And at the time, Tristram began Harvard at the age of 13 after studying at the Governor's Academy. And the classes by 1851 had grown to 25 to 26 students. And one of his classmates was John Adams. They both started their freshman year together, and they both graduated together. And John Adams started a month shy of turning 16. And so John Adams turned 16 in October, shortly after classes began. And so who is Michael Dalton, and how did he have the thought to send Tristram to Harvard, and what did he think was going to come of it? I'm trying to find my notes on it. I've got them somewhere. Maybe I'll just remember without looking. Yeah, so I'll never remember this. So Michael Dalton, Tristram's father, who came from Hampton, and he settled on the waterfront. His father died at the age of 13, and so you think he's some orphan pup with not a lot of money. Well, these people were loaded. Michael Dalton was the great-grandson of Philemon Dalton, who was born in England in 1590. And it was actually Michael Dalton's father, also Philemon Dalton, who was Deacon Philemon Dalton. And he had, again, great amount of land, and also had a great number of children. However, as I said, Michael had lost his father at the age of 13. And, he must have had some prodding. He must have had some direction by one of his uncles, all very well-educated family, very wealthy, very prosperous family, that set him on the right course. And he went to sea, many times cabin boys who would go to sea would apprentice to become a sea captain. We see this as a portrait of Samuel Woodbury at the Cushing House, taken when he was, I can't remember, 8 years old. And he worked his way up through the ranks and ultimately became a sea captain. And this very well could have been the case for Michael Dalton. Wherever Michael Dalton went, he influenced a lot. And when the St. Paul's Church was established over in the where the Belleville Church is now in 1711, the wealth of the merchants had such a gravitational pull that they pulled the church from the plains over to where it is now at the top of Market Street and High Street. And Michael Dalton was instrumental in that, and to the point where he was even displeased. He got outvoted by who was going to be the Reverend this Matthias Plant, and he was displeased. He even went to England to protest to get him removed from that. So I'm mentioning this because Michael Dalton was also one of the leaders in the separation of Newburyport from Newbury. So he just wasn't sitting back on his hands collecting money and waiting for his ship to come in. He was heavily involved in civic affairs. Hopefully I can find my place. Yep. So Tristram is 13 years old. John Adams, beginning your freshman year. The Dalton Genealogical Society has a great webpage. It's very good. Again, it's not devoid of things to question, but it's actually very, very good. There's a great number of letters that we find. One of them from John Adams. John Adams refers to Tristram Dalton in his autobiography. In my own class at college, there are several others for whom I had, he's looking back 40 years, whom I had strong, this is in his autobiography, several others for whom I had strong affection. Wentworth, Brown, Livingston, Sewell, and Dalton, all of whom have been eminent in life, excepting Livingston, who died within a year or two after his first degree. Another letter, this was written in 1758, this would have been when Tristram was in Salem, studying law, and I find this absolutely amusing. This is one of these, taken out of context and not knowing the relationship between Dalton and Adams, you think that Adams really didn't like Dalton at all, but in hindsight you'll find that he's really just giving a really good ribbing amongst friends. So Adams writes 3 letters to 3 different friends studying law in 3 different places, and this one went like this. How long is it, my friend, since I have either received a letter from you or you from me? Some years, I believe. And how long will it be ere another letter passes between us? Why, if I may judge of the future by the past, I shall receive one from you in about 6 months hence, and then an intermission of 2 or 3 years will succeed. This has been the course of your correspondence, and perhaps you would be as well pleased if the intermission should be 2 or 3 centuries instead of 2 or 3 years. You need not hope, however, to escape. And I left out a section, and Adams continues, the study of law, and this is great, the study of law is most dry. This is what Adams is writing Dalton. The study of law is most dry, unentertaining study in the world, the most unentertaining study in the world, which I take to be as wise as ladies' contempt of Shakespeare's tragedies in the Lethe of Mr. Garrick. You have heard many persons say that the study of mathematics and physics is dry too. Others can find no beauty in poetry, and I believe them, as undoubtedly as I believe some others. When they say the law is dry, everything, my friend, is dry in proportion as it is not understood, and I shall not be at all surprised to hear a young spark, you Dalton, whose attention is dissipated among horses and ladies, heaven forgive me, fiddles and frolics, cards and romances, say the law is dry. So I think, to me, that's wonderful that he really kind of gets to Tristram's lighter side and is seen his lighter side as a teenager growing up. So I think this is a perfect time for me to, if I can find it, recite the historian's narrative that was written for the Marquette we have in the other room. And hopefully the background that I've just given will shed light on what was written and make more sense of it. Tristram Dalton developed into quite the bon vivant at a young age and became internationally known as the consummate host with all the social graces that accompanied the moniker. He grew up in a Georgian colonial manse on State Street, now home to the Gentlemen's Club, founded just before the turn of the 20th century. The Dalton Club commemorates and celebrates Tristram's legacy as a most gracious socialite. Portraits don the walls of his former home with the likes of Washington, Jefferson, Adams, Monroe, as well as patriots Rufus King, the Makita Lafayette, and Theophilus Parsons, all counted amongst Tristram's most prominent guests. Elitists such as Dalton weren't hard to find in the colonial port that attracted its fair share of established gentry, as well as the up-and-coming nouveau riche. Divisions of the British social class vary and can be highly controversial, but what is clear is that they are influenced by factors of wealth, occupation, and education. Within 100 years of the Great Migration, we find that the same hierarchies in which they were in part escaping from are reestablished, complete with coats of arms displayed on the mantels. The Church of England becoming the merchants' church, and the sea captains, of course, relegated to Old South and churches of lesser social status. Today you can even find Tristram's tabletop grave marker erected by him well before his death within the walls of St. Paul's Church on High Street. Tristram graduated from Harvard in 1755 when class rank was determined in part by the wealth of his father and not necessarily academic achievement, another time-honored British tradition. After Harvard, he studied law in Salem and passed the bar but never practiced. When you ever Google Tristram Dalton, that line always comes up, passed the bar but never practiced. I don't know why. Instead, deciding to join his father as a ship owner and merchant. In 1758, he married Ruth, daughter of Marblehead's richest merchant, Robert King Hooper. He wasn't called king because he was imperious. He was called king because he was just very good to people. Of course, having the right pedigree, Ruth found herself at home on State Street, surrounded by all the trappings Dalton's wealth could afford. Purely democratic ideals are difficult to find prior to 1774. The first settlers in the Great Migration certainly did not believe in democratic ideas. And most educated scholars accepted the Whig theory in which a small dash of democracy was balanced by equal parts of aristocracy and monarchy. Under this tenet, Tristram Dalton rose to the office of Newburyport Board of Selectmen, being one of the wealthiest citizens of the bustling seaport town. As colonists began to destabilize British oversight, a shadow government emerged throughout the colonies in order to run the local governments. The selectmen were thus renamed the Committee of Safety, Correspondence, and Inspection, for which Tristram Dalton continued as chair. As the revolutionary conflict continued, these communities rapidly took on greater powers, filling the vacuum left by the colonial governments. The committees also began to collect taxes, recruit soldiers, and syndicate to produce and share military supplies such as gunpowder and ships. In the year 1780, the Massachusetts Constitution, which was drafted by classmate and lifelong friend John Adams, Theophilus Parsons, and others, went into effect. Within 3 years of its adoption, slavery was abolished in Massachusetts. This, in turn, directly affecting Tristram, who had been recorded as owning 3 servants. It's kind of interesting. It was also found that by Reverend Plant in 1741 that it was revealed that 10% of Newburyport's population was slaves at that time, and that Michael was also a slave owner. But by 1782, Tristram Dalton was the highest taxpayer in Newburyport, the 3rd wealthiest community in the Commonwealth after Boston and Salem. With his ships, he aided the war effort by running supplies to Boston, supplying 9 privateers and provision ships from his merchant fleet to the Penobscot expedition, which was a complete failure. Dalton served as a member of the Massachusetts House of Representatives from 1782 to 1785, and serving as a speaker in 1784, and a state senator from 86 to 88. He was elected as a delegate to the state convention on the adoption of the United States Constitution. When it came time for Massachusetts to select its first U.S. senator, the merchants made the Constitution. The Massachusetts Supreme Court Justice James Sullivan said, and they should name the candidate. And so it was James Sullivan who felt that the merchants were the ones that really brought the country together, and they should be represented in the government. And so Federalist Tristram Dalton was accordingly chosen and proceeded to New York. So getting back to what we were talking about earlier with the schoolboys at Harvard liking all their fancy things, and the coat of arms over the mantelpieces. So there's Tristram Dalton, after being elected U.S. Senator from Massachusetts. He was chosen and proceeded to New York in his own 4-horse coach, emblazoned with the Dalton arms, and attended by servants from the Dalton livery. So it looked a little kingly. I think we could all kind of picture it. And he was quoted at the time as saying, "Everything that can affect shipbuilding, I shall watch with a jealous eye." Dalton wrote a constituent. It should be mentioned that over the course, I apologize, everything that can affect shipbuilding, I shall watch with a jealous eye, Dalton wrote a constituent. It should be mentioned that over the course of Dalton's 2 short years in office as U.S. Senator, he missed only 1 of 100 roll calls. During this period, Ruth Dalton found herself aptly adapted to an even higher standard of entertaining in New York. Tristram Dalton's life was a rare one, filled with contradiction, adoption, adaptation, divestment, and divergence. One filled with levity and civic engagement seldom seen then or now. Arguably a better mason than an architect, he served under the British as a stakeholder, behind the revolution in the transitional shadow government, and as U.S. Senator of a brand new nation. He was a debonair socialite with an appetite for life, recognition, and fortune that he may well never satiate. So, to me, that was in doing the research for this paper. That was what impressed me the most, was that he ran Newburyport under three different governments, and how few people, even in colonial times, would have done that. And I think that's, to me, extraordinarily interesting. And I think the last thing I promised was a little something about the Dalton Club. If I can find it. Yeah. So, the Dalton Club. gets attacked every once in a while for being a men's club. Excuse me. But the history of men's club really starts to take root in England. Americans very imitative of the English and continue to be. The 19th century brought an explosion of popularity to clubs, particularly around the 1880s. And at the height of their influence, this is in London, in the late 19th century, London had over 400 men's clubs. I think that's impressive. This expansion can be explained in part by the large extensions of the franchise and the Reform Acts of 1832, 1867, and 1885. So they kept allowing more and more men to vote. And so a voting person in England considered themselves to be a gentleman, and so they could start a men's club. And there was as they received the status of a gentleman, thus they sought out a club. And existing clubs with strict limits in membership numbers had long waiting lists and were generally wary of such new enfranchised potential members. And so these people began forming clubs of their own. And in Newburyport, there were dozens and dozens of clubs. And if anybody goes through any of the city directories, they may be in there, they may be in the newspapers. There's a club, there could be the South End Laugh Out Loud Club. A lot of these clubs didn't have clubhouses. I think the Dalton Club, to me it's the 21st century, very much going back to comparing the Newbury farmers to the merchants. The Newbury farmers really had all the money. And so we look at what the endowment of the Dalton Club is, and the cash flow and the stability of the club. The North End Boat Club could probably buy and sell the Dalton Club 5 times. And I think that's kind of funny. Because I'm certainly partially because of the waterfront. The North End Boat Club, in 1978, when they established the channel, and you can build docks out to the channel, the North End Boat Club just happened to be at the right place at the right time, so they could build docks way out where others were put out of business over time. Maybe this is a good time for me to end.
Questions. I just wanted to tell you all, this is a special episode. These are on sale for $20 downstairs, and they have, what Jay went through in terms of Tristram Dalton, as well as all the other people that we had in our exhibit. So, I can guarantee you, probably in 30 or 40 years, you'll see these on eBay for hundreds of dollars. So it's a good deal. $20 normally $25 today. So any questions for Jay?
Did Tristram Dalton play a musical instrument?
Yes, he did. And I believe it was the flute.
Okay, a follow-up to that, though it's not like it. Did he have any connection to John Quincy Adams?
Well, John Quincy Adams came to, very good question, John Quincy Adams came to Newburyport to study law under Theophilus Parsons, and John Adams was a lawyer himself, and obviously impressed all of the teachers at Harvard when he went there. He actually went there on scholarship. John Quincy Adams came to Newburyport to study law under Theophilus Parsons, who wrote or helped to write the Massachusetts Constitution, and he had what was considered the largest law library in the hemisphere, and that was why John Adams sent his son John Quincy Adams. And these boys, I think Theophilus Parsons' home was on Federal Street at the time, and he may have had 6 students studying law under him. and they all circulated to the Dalton house, and with the two Dalton girls, there was the Frasers. The Frasers were an incredibly wealthy family. They own the house, which is the Rogers Funeral Home on Green Street. It's a Georgian colonial that was raised to make it look like a 3-story federal. And John Quincy Adams loved one of the Fraser girls, and but they just looked at the Adams family as just working class lawyers that were just working paycheck to paycheck. It was laughable. They had so much money, it was just laughable. These merchants had Tristram mentioned that these merchants had between 600 and 900 pounds in their estates. Michael Dalton, when he purchased his first house, which is on the northern corner of Market Square before he built what's known as the Dalton House today, he built that. He paid 1,000 pounds for that at the time. He was a very young man, but it was great. I remember I thought we were doing the Diary of John Quincy Adams, and one of my favorite lines that the fellow gave was at the firehouse, and he was reciting, and he said that John Quincy Adams, he heard of the death of Miss Fraser, and at a very advanced age, and he just stood, and he says, "I love her, and I love her memory still." And that from the Fraser gal on Green Street, Newburyport. So yes, these families all circulated around. Yes?
This question keeps coming up in my mind through all of these guys. Why would the merchant shipping class have supported the revolution? Why would they turn themselves against the British Empire that basically was protecting their shipping businesses?
Well, I think the mantra is taxation without representation, and I think the colonists were being bled dry to the point where they were in such a trade balance. They couldn't even keep currency in the country. So during the colonial times, the most popular, the reason why we call the dollar the dollars and not the pound is because it was after the Spanish dollar, or the real, the piece of 8. That's where we get the word quarter. They cut it in quarters with a chisel. And as fast as that money would come in, as wealthy as the money would go out because of the huge trade imbalance. So they were really at a disadvantage. The British also were putting a lot of limitations on treaties that were made with Native Americans. So they had moved a lot of the settlers back east of the Appalachia. And there's a million reasons. And I'm certainly not an expert, but that's my best answer today.
Second question,
Yeah.
which I gave you a few weeks ago. The privateering that took place before the war, during the war, all the way up into the 1812 war.
Yeah.
The way I look at that is that the country as a whole was not an industrial base, had no way of producing armaments on the scale that they needed to take on the British Empire. So did the armaments come from the privateers?
It came in large from, it came from a few places. It came from private. It came from granting of land. It came from a lot of the notes, especially in Pennsylvania, that were backed with land. It was hugely inflationary times. You'd see these photographs of Nazi Germany of people, they were printing money for the war effort, and the dollar, the banknotes were pretty much worthless. You see people going to the store with a barrel full of money to buy a loaf of bread. And it was very inflationary times. It was so bad that, speaking of John Quincy Adams, there was Francis Stadler, who was a member of the Continental Congress, who he and John Adams and John Quincy Adams went to St. Petersburg to go to appeal to Russia for money. And no one would speak to them. But they were there for a year trying to. John Quincy Adams went there. I think he must have been, I can't remember if he was 10 years old or 11. He was brought along because out of the three, he was the only one who could speak French. And at the time, French was the international language of diplomacy. So we were trying to get money wherever we could, and the French certainly helped, and to their own detriment. And it's Marquis de Lafayette. I can't think of too many towns from here to Portsmouth, but there isn't a Lafayette Street named after him. He was a hero. He came back in 1824 and paraded, and he'd be greeted at the Tracey house by old veterans of the war, absolutely beloved. And I think a lot of Americans forget the French involvement for that reason, but it was a large because of Marquis de Lafayette. His wife actually was going to be beheaded in a guillotine during the French Revolution. I think it was Madison, Ollie Madison wrote a letter of appeal and let her off the hook on that. Sorry, go ahead.
This is a silly question, but I find it intriguing about this like hand going inside the vest.
Yeah.
And when I look at the direction it's going, it's not like the logical in the opening. It's going like the opposite. You know what I'm saying? Like it should go, my shirt is like this. Go in here and they're like making it go backwards.
Yeah. See, that is a silly question. But no, I looking at it in that detail, I agree. There was probably some wrangling at the time the portrait was taken. I don't know, but I think that there's still even a time today between maybe not having your photograph taken, but between an artist and its subject to what are you going to do with the hands? You're going to do something with the hands. You just can't stand there. And so they just fell on the classics.
And just as a follow-up, and I don't know if it was that
Napoleon probably made that.
Yeah, Napoleon.
So he was made that most, but this was going on 100 years before Napoleon was doing it.
Oh, sure. But then I also wonder, like, in today's world, women's blouses button on the opposite from men's?
Yeah.
Right. Well, we're looking at a picture when there wasn't a left or right shoe. So fashion's come a long way since then.
It has to do with servants buttoning up the blouse for the women.
Oh.
Somehow.
He didn't mention his end. As I understand it, he lost all of his money.
Right. I don't know what that really means with rich people, But they gave him a token job as customs official in Boston the last 3 years of his life. I can't remember what 18, 15, 16, 17. But yes, and so he lost. He made a great bet in real estate, taking George. He was moving to Georgetown. He sold all of his property in Newbury. He sold the property off Pipestave Hill. Pipestave Hill brought more than the State Street property. Pipestave Hill sold for 3,800 pounds. And I think High Street was 1,800 pounds. 1,800, the property had been greatly reduced from when Michael Dalton had originally purchased it in 1746. The Tickens bought a good swath of it and other people. So as the waterfront grew, these larger estates started to sell off.
Well, that whole area behind the Dalton House garden.
Right, and both Michael loved gardens and Tristram loved gardens, but so he went all in on real estate, and it ultimately paid off. But it's almost like making a futures bet. You've got the futures bet. You're going to get called, and it just didn't develop fast enough. He lost most of his possessions on the ship that he had heading there too. So there are a few things, but I don't think the ship full of his tangible personal property was going to do it. He lost a fortune, and just the two properties alone, not to mention altogether was the land speculation that really got him. Yes.
I have two questions.
Okay.
Did he marry, have children?
Oh, that's a very good question. Yes, he married Ruth Hooper. She was the daughter of King Hooper of Marblehead, and then they had two girls. They had a number of children, but two reached adulthood. Daughters.
Yes.
One married White from Haverhill, and they had an amazing wedding at Pipestake Hill. And they had the carriages and everything at that time.
The coat of arms.
Yeah, the coat of arms.
The other question was, what happens at the Dalton Club now?
So there are a number of clubs in and around Newburyport, and when the Dalton Club first was founded in 1795, it was 1894. It was founded by 12 men, and they named it the Independent Men's Social Club, and it was in the Daily News building when it was on Inn Street. They rented the second floor. And the very next year, they decided to rename it the Dalton Club, not knowing that they would eventually own his house. So in 1895, by a vote of 8-4, the Independent Men's Social Club became the Dalton Club. And then ultimately, just by luck, a couple of years later, the property became available.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm not, from what I've read, to your question that Dalton invested tremendously in Washington, D.C. on the advice of George Washington, who he knew, who encouraged him to sell property and buy property here. And that he and a lot of other people did so, and as you said, when you get a lot of investment coming, what happens, there's a bubble, and when the bubble crashed, then he had invested an extremely large amount of his fortune, and that left him not a wealthy man.
Reduced.
Yes. Reduced. And in Boston, and was saved, as I understand, by James Madison, who he wrote to and pleaded for a job with the federal government.
Thank you for sharing that. So,
and that federal government was here and his hometown to get a job.
I don't know if everybody heard that, but it was through James Madison, who wrote the Constitution of the United States. He's also the slightest president, I don't know, 5'4". And I think he was the youngest to sign the Declaration of Independence, but he would just mention that Tristram Dalton made an appeal to Madison for some sort of support, and Madison found him a job at the Customs House. Do I have that right?
Yeah,
Super.
no,
Thank you.
that's right. He was in Boston, and he moved back here. His wife, I believe, stayed in Boston in whatever dwelling they had, and after his death, ran a boarding house, which is a way for her to make an income, and his body was transported here and to St. Paul's and put in a tomb for his parents. He had built when he was a wealthy man for his parents, because it was there, and they didn't really have the funds to build a new mausoleum. So
but it was also kind of a nice spot on the front garden.
Yeah, front garden, all that. Yeah.
And just back to Jeff's, because he mentioned, where did all this armament come from? And
after he said that, I sort of read up a little bit on that the armament was all made overseas, but that the larger picture.
There were some arms manufacturers outside of New York City. You'd have some up the, what's Route 9 out in Western Mass. There's a lot of foundries that would produce weapons, swords, and such. So there was a lot going on, for sure. Yeah.
And also the larger picture that when we think of the American Revolution, don't always think about is that Britain and France and Spain were fighting for the world.
Yes.
And they were at war for 100 years back and forth. And every time they were at war, merchants out of Newburyport and all these other places were getting letters of marque so they could just capture, it was fair game to get a Spanish ship or a French ship or any other kind of ship. And the armaments or anything on that then became their possession after they gave a cut to the U.S. government and all.
That is very true, but I think also, although that may have been going on after 1789, during the French War, we wanted to keep our heads down and stay very insular and not get involved in it because we had enough problems at home, and we couldn't afford to become a target especially after the War of 1812, anything like that.
Yeah.
I think we're at the top of the hour. So if we can thank you again. Winter's almost over, so it's gonna stay. The county's gonna stay warm like this until like June. So.